There is a name that every child in Angola knows, a name carved into statues, painted on murals, printed on currency, a name that survived 500 years of colonial erasure and still stands, stubborn and unbroken, like the woman herself. That name is Nzinga. And if you have never heard it before today, that is not an accident. That is a choice someone made a long time ago on another continent to decide which stories the world would be allowed to keep, which leaders would appear in the history books that European children studied, which kingdoms would be described as civilizations, and which would be written off as tribes waiting to be organized by a more enlightened hand. This is the story of a queen who looked the Portuguese Empire in the eye, at the very height of its global power, when it controlled oceans and continents and entire peoples, when its flag flew from Brazil to Goa to the coast of Africa, when there was genuinely no military force in the Atlantic world better equipped or better financed. And she said, "Not here, not my kingdom, not my people," and she meant it. For 30 years she fought, into her 70s, with armies and with alliances and with a diplomatic intelligence so sharp that it still impresses scholars who study her letters today. She was captured and lost and mourned and risen, multiple times. She changed religions when it served her. She changed tactics when the old ones failed. She changed her base of operations twice. She changed everything she needed to change, and never, not once, surrendered the one thing that mattered, her sovereignty. This is not a fairy tale. This is documented history, preserved in Portuguese colonial archives, in Italian missionary accounts, in the oral traditions of the Mbundu people of Angola. And it is long overdue. She was born sometime around 1583 in the kingdom of Ndongo, in what is now the country of Angola on the western coast of Central Africa. Her father was Ngola Quilombo Kia Kasenda, the king, the Ngola of Ndongo, and from the very beginning, Nzinga was not treated the way daughters were typically treated in that world or in that era. There is a story told about her birth. When she came into the world, the umbilical cord was wrapped around her neck, a sign, the elders said, of a child who would be proud, strong, and very difficult to rule. Her father believed it. He saw in her, from the time she was young, something he did not always find in his sons. A mind that could hold complexity without being broken by it. A mind that cut through the surface of a problem and went straight to the mechanism underneath. He brought her with him to meetings. He let her sit quietly and listen, while he negotiated with neighboring lords and visiting traders. He taught her not only Kimbundu, the language of the Mbundu people, but the languages of neighboring kingdoms. He made her understand that knowledge was the first weapon, and unlike land or gold, it was the one thing no enemy could take from you simply by arriving with more men. She absorbed all of it. Everything he showed her, she kept. Ndongo was a Mbundu kingdom, one of several in the region, with its own political structure, its own economy built around agriculture and the regional trade in salt and iron, its own military traditions, its own spiritual system. For generations, it had existed as a sovereign state, with complex relationships, sometimes tributary, sometimes adversarial, with the larger Congo Empire to the north. It was not a small or insignificant place. It had its own complexity, its own layered history. The Europeans who arrived on its coastline in the 15th and 16th centuries were not discovering an empty land or a people without structure. They were encountering a civilization that had been building itself for centuries before anyone in Lisbon had ever heard of Angola. By the time Nzinga was a young woman, the Portuguese had already been in the region for nearly 100 years. They had established the city of Luanda on the coast in 1575, building a port where before there had been a beach and fishing villages. They had treaties with some local rulers. They had trading posts that reached increasingly far into the interior. They had a colonial administration staffed by governors appointed in Lisbon, soldiers who had come from Portugal or from Brazil, merchants whose only interest in Africa was what could be extracted from it. They wanted two things, as colonial powers always want two things: land and labor. The land part was about territorial expansion and control of trade routes. The labor part was about enslaved people. The Portuguese slave trade from Angola was already by the early 1600s one of the largest and most systematic forced migration operations in human history. Ships left Luanda by the dozens every year, packed with people taken from the interior, some captured in wars, some sold by neighboring kingdoms, some simply seized in raids, and transported across the Atlantic to work on sugar plantations in Brazil. The numbers are staggering even now. Over the course of 4 centuries, Angola exported more enslaved people than any other region on Earth. Nzinga's father resisted this, which put him in direct and escalating conflict with the Portuguese administration. After his death, power passed to Nzinga's older brother, Angola Mbandi, and here is where the family history becomes complicated in ways that are uncomfortable to narrate without distortion in either direction. Angola Mbandi was not the man his father was. He was insecure in ways that manifested as cruelty. He was erratic. He was deeply afraid of his sister's intelligence and of the loyalty she commanded from nobles and people around the court who had watched her grow up and understood what she was. According to accounts passed down through oral tradition and corroborated by some missionary sources, he had Nzinga's son killed, eliminating a potential heir who might one day serve as a rallying point for those who preferred her leadership over his. He also reportedly had her subjected to a procedure intended to prevent her from bearing more children, a permanent removal of the threat of succession. The accounts differ on precise details. What does not differ is this: her brother feared her, and he tried to neutralize her by taking from her the most intimate things a person can have. Nzinga endured this. She did not have the power yet to do otherwise, but she was not passive. She watched, she waited. She built the relationships and the reputation that her brother was too frightened to allow her to have, openly, quietly accumulating the trust of the people around her. And then came 1621, and everything changed. The Portuguese governor of Angola, João Correia de Sousa, was pressing the kingdom of Ndongo from every direction, demanding tribute, demanding territory, demanding the right to raid for enslaved people without interference from the kingdom's authorities. Angola Mbandi was losing ground steadily, politically and militarily. He needed a diplomat, someone who could walk into a Portuguese colonial chamber and hold a conversation at the level of sophistication the Portuguese respected, someone who would not flinch. He sent Nzinga. She arrived in Luanda in 1621. What happened in that room has been recorded in Portuguese colonial documents, in the writings of Italian Capuchin missionaries who were present or received accounts from those who were, and in the oral histories of the Mbundu people. The core of what happened is consistent across all these sources. The Portuguese governor received her in a formal audience. He sat on a chair, high-backed, carved, the chair of a man who considered himself the authority in the room. For Nzinga, there was no chair. There was the floor, a deliberate arrangement, a signal clear to everyone present about hierarchy and submission, about who stood above and who knelt below. Nzinga took in the room. She understood exactly what had been done, and she did not protest it. She did not object or demand a seat or allow her face to show the insult. Instead, she gestured to one of the women who had traveled with her as attendants. The woman immediately knelt on all fours on the floor before her. Nzinga sat on her attendant's back as though she were a throne, adjusted herself, and then turned to face the Portuguese governor as a complete equal. That gesture has been analyzed and discussed for 400 years. It was theater, it was negotiation, it was a refusal, delivered in perfect silence without a single word of grievance, to accept the role that had been arranged for her. She did not argue about the chair. She simply made the absence of a chair entirely irrelevant. The negotiations that followed were substantive and sophisticated. Nzinga spoke Portuguese. She understood the colonial legal framework in enough depth to argue within it rather than outside of it. She pressed for the return of Mbundu nobles who had been enslaved in violation of existing agreements between Ndongo and the colonial administration. She pressed for formal recognition of Ndongo's sovereignty. She discussed terms of trade and non-interference, and during the visit, she accepted baptism, converting publicly to Christianity, and taking a Portuguese godfather. She received a Christian name, Ana de Sousa. Some historians have read this as capitulation. It was not. It was the same kind of calculation that made her sit on her attendant's back rather than the floor. Becoming Christian gave her a layer of legitimacy within the Portuguese colonial system. It gave her access to missionaries who could serve as neutral intermediaries and witnesses. It gave her a religious vocabulary that the Portuguese understood and respected, a framework within which she could make claims that the colonial administration had to acknowledge rather than dismiss. She was playing the colonizer's game, but she was playing to win. She returned to Ndongo with partial concessions, enough to buy time, not enough to resolve the underlying conflict. Back in the kingdom, her brother's position continued to deteriorate. His decisions had alienated the nobles whose loyalty he needed. His military campaigns had failed. His relationship with the Portuguese had become one of perpetual, humiliating retreat. In 1624, N'Gola Mbandi died. The circumstances remain disputed across different sources. Some accounts suggest suicide, some suggest illness, some suggest that Nzinga had a hand in it. What followed was a struggle for succession in the Ndongo court. Nzinga emerged in control, claiming the throne as regent for her brother's young son. And then, in a decision that was brutal and deliberate and entirely consistent with the political logic of her moment, she had the nephew killed. This is the hardest part of Nzinga's early story, to present without either excuse or condemnation, because the truth is neither. She was not a saint. She was a ruler. Her brother had murdered her son. The nephew, however innocent himself, would always be available as a rival claimant, always useful to those who wanted to destabilize her. She chose her kingdom's survival over mercy. European monarchs who made identical calculations are called great. Henry VIII executed rivals and co-conspirators without hesitation. Ivan the Terrible murdered his own son in a rage. Elizabeth I signed the death warrant of her cousin. The moral assessment somehow shifts when the ruler is African. Nzinga became queen, and the Portuguese, who had tolerated her as a useful diplomat, found themselves facing something they had not prepared for. She refused to negotiate away her kingdom piece by piece. She was going to fight. The Portuguese refused to recognize her as the legitimate ruler of Ndongo, backing instead a succession of puppet rulers, local men they could control, men willing to sign treaties surrendering land, and people in exchange for the illusion of authority. This was the colonial playbook applied across Africa and the Americas and Asia with numbing repetition. Find the weakest candidate, install them, extract everything before they understand what has happened. Nzinga understood this without needing to see it explained. She pulled her people back from the lowlands the Portuguese controlled and began organizing resistance from the interior, building alliances, recruiting warriors, establishing a mobile court that could function and govern without a fixed capital the Portuguese could simply occupy. She made an alliance that genuinely alarmed the colonial administration. She sent emissaries to the Imbangala. These were fierce, highly mobile warrior bands, men who operated by their own code, who owed loyalty to no fixed king, who had no permanent settlements, and no interest in the political arrangements of the sedentary kingdoms around them. They were, by most accounts in the historical record, genuinely terrifying to the societies that encountered them. Nzinga did not merely hire them, she absorbed them. She adopted their military rituals. She trained alongside her warriors. She wore warrior's dress rather than the formal attire of royalty. She was present on the battlefield, not at a safe remove, watching from a hilltop, but in the thick of the campaign, commanding, deciding, fighting. She was in her 40s by this point, leading an army through the forests of Central Africa. The Portuguese pressed from the coast with firearms and professional soldiers and the infrastructure of empire behind them. But the interior was not the coast. The terrain worked against them. Their supply lines stretched thin over distances that felt impossible. European diseases that the soldiers themselves survived weakened them in the heat, and local disease killed Europeans who had no immunity at rates that Portuguese commanders in Lisbon could not quite comprehend until they saw the casualty reports. Nzinga's forces were fast. They knew the land. They did not need to fight a European-style engagement to win. They needed to make the cost of the campaign prohibitive. And they were doing exactly that. For years, the war moved back and forth. Nzinga lost territory and won it back. She retreated to a neighboring kingdom called Matamba, which she took by force and rebuilt into her new base of operations. From Matamba, she could continue organizing resistance while remaining beyond the reach of direct Portuguese military pressure on the coast. And then the Dutch arrived. The Netherlands and Portugal had been fighting over Atlantic trade routes for decades. In 1641, a Dutch naval force captured Luanda from the sea, the Portuguese colonial capital, taken almost overnight. Nzinga saw the opening immediately and moved with the speed that had always characterized her thinking. She sent envoys to the Dutch commander in Luanda. She proposed a military alliance. She would coordinate with Dutch naval power from the land side, pressing the Portuguese from the interior while the Dutch held the coast. Together, they would remove Portugal from Angola entirely. The Dutch agreed. For 3 years, this coalition was the dominant military reality in the region. Nzinga's forces advanced. Portuguese forces retreated inland toward the highlands, fighting to hold fragments of what they had controlled. It was the closest anyone came, in the entire 17th century, to reversing Portuguese control of the Angolan coast. In 1648, a massive Portuguese fleet arrived from Brazil, 15 ships, over 1,000 soldiers, backed by the full resources of the Portuguese crown, which had calculated that Angola, and the slave trade that flowed through it, was worth whatever it cost to retake. The Dutch were pushed out of Luanda within weeks. The alliance dissolved. Nzinga was alone again. She was in her mid-60s. Any other leader facing this situation, betrayed by allies, outgunned, exhausted after more than 2 decades of continuous warfare, watching the empire she had fought regain full control of the coast, would have looked for an honorable exit, a treaty that preserved some dignity, a negotiated peace that allowed a quiet withdrawal. She kept fighting. What followed was a guerrilla campaign of extraordinary endurance. Matamba became not just her capital, but a sanctuary for her forces, for escaped slaves fleeing the Portuguese raiding operations that swept the interior, for refugees from kingdoms that had been absorbed by the colonial system. She built an economy, controlled trade routes between the interior and the coast, made herself indispensable to the commercial networks that even the Portuguese depended on. She became too expensive to defeat and too integrated into the regional economy to simply ignore. The Portuguese governors of Angola changed with the years and the decades. Each new governor assessed the situation in the interior and arrived at the same conclusion. A decisive military victory over Nzinga was not achievable at a cost the colonial administration could sustain. She simply would not break. She would not make the final error. She would not give them the pitched battle on open ground that European tactics were designed to win. In 1657, when Nzinga was somewhere in her mid-70s, an age at which almost everyone who had known her in her youth was dead, she signed a peace treaty with the Portuguese, a genuine one negotiated over months of careful correspondence, one that recognized Matamba as a sovereign kingdom, one that required Portuguese withdrawal from certain territories, one that contained, by any fair reading, a significant portion of her original demands. She had held out for 30 years. She had outlasted every governor who tried to defeat her, and in the end, they signed her terms. She spent the final years of her life governing Matamba with the same sharp intelligence she had always brought to every challenge. She hosted missionaries in her court. She oversaw trade. She dictated letters, remarkable documents that survive in Portuguese and Vatican archives, revealing a mind that age had not dimmed. She wrote to the Pope. She organized ceremonies that blended Catholic ritual with Mbundu spiritual tradition without apology for either. She died in December 1663 at approximately 80 years old. At her request, she was buried wearing the habit of a Franciscan nun, with her bow and arrows placed beside her. That image, the Christian habit and the warrior's weapons, together in death as they had been in life, is the most precise summary anyone could have designed. The Portuguese who had fought her for 30 years mourned her publicly. The governor of Angola sent a letter to Lisbon describing her as the greatest adversary and the most remarkable ruler he had encountered in Africa. Missionaries wrote accounts that survive to this day, describing her intelligence, her memory, her ability to hold multiple political strategies simultaneously without losing the thread of any of them. In the centuries that followed, the colonial telling of her story reduced her to a curiosity. The warrior queen, the strange African woman who sat on a human throne, the native who fought beyond her station. The depth of her strategic intelligence was minimized. The sophistication of her resistance was dismissed. she became a footnote. In Angola itself, she could not be forgotten. The people she had protected carried her memory in ways that no colonial administration could reach. In 1975, when Angola finally gained independence from Portugal after 500 years of colonial rule, her image appeared everywhere. On flags, on banners, on the murals of a people who had just won the fight she had started. Today there is a statue of her in Luanda's central square, on the waterfront of the same bay where Portuguese slave ships once loaded their human cargo. She stands in bronze. She holds a weapon. She looks out at the sea with an expression that has no defeat in it. The pose is not accidental. The people who built that statue knew exactly what they were saying. They were saying, she never stopped standing, and neither, for 30 years against the most powerful empire in the Atlantic world, did she. Her name is Nzinga, and now you know it.